This is the Linguistics Podcast. Questions or comments can be directed to Twitter at LinguistChris or via email to linguistchris@gmail.com. Hello and welcome to the Linguistics Podcast. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about language learning. The last episode, of course, was on routinization, and so this episode is sort of a follow-up. I want to have you all keep routinization in your minds as I go through language learning, and my wife Katie is going to help us with this episode. I'm just going to be interviewing her, talking to her about her experiences learning mostly French and some ASL, American Sign Language, and this is going to be interesting because you haven't been learning French in how long?
About 2 years. About
2 years now. So language attrition, which is essentially not using linguistic skills that you've learned, will be at play here. And I'm very interested in exactly what types of things that she remembers and what types of things she doesn't remember, and this is sort of going to play into our episode on routinization, because obviously the things that she remembers most will have been best routinized, if you will, or best automatized, or what have you. Some things will not have been automatized at all, and so those things will be completely gone at this point due to attrition. I can speak to that as well. I as an undergraduate, I minored in Japanese, and now my Japanese is practically completely gone, with the exception of a few phrases here and there, and knowledge of the kana and things like that. Otherwise, nothing left. So that's language attrition. And I think that it can be an interesting insight into exactly how language learning works in adults. Now, let me stress that. We're talking here about adult language learning, foreign language learning, not children. Children are a completely different ballgame, and we're going to get into that next episode. However, we who listen to this podcast certainly like to learn languages. That's part of the fun of linguistics. And so this is going to be an interesting insight, I think, for all of you. So I want to say hello to Katie. Hello.
Hello.
And let's go ahead and get started. So you said last time you learned, or were learning French, was about 2 years ago. What kinds of methods were employed in the classroom to teach you French? Just try and remember back then. What kinds of tasks did you guys have to do? Did you have a lot of conversation?
Yeah, there was a lot of group-based conversation, immersion, questions and answers from the book.
Just that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in terms of the conversation, the point of that was to be fluent, right? I mean, the point was to try and build fluency.
Right.
To try and be able
to recall it and...
Right, so quick recall, the ability to just sort of talk without thinking, right? That's what you're trying to develop. Now, in terms of written work, can you tell me a little bit about that? So which did you find easier, speaking or writing in your French class?
Speaking.
Speaking, okay. Why?
Well, the spelling in French is horrible.
Right, so let me say a word about that. So one of the common things that we in linguistics like to remember is that writing is not language. So if you are if you're writing down something, you are using symbols to represent the sounds of a language, right? And certain systems will be easier than others in terms of having relationships between symbol and sound. So if you know anything about French, you know that words like français end in an S in French orthography. And that seems weird, right? Because there's no S when you're pronouncing it. You don't say française unless you're talking about something in the feminine. In the masculine, there is no S there to be spoken of. And so the question is, well, why do you write the S? Well, it's because that's how their orthography works. It's still there to represent the fact that when you do use it in the feminine, then you end up saying that S. Why they don't just leave it off in the masculine and add it in the feminine, I don't know. But the point is that the orthography can add in some extra difficulty in language learning that is not there in the spoken language. So I'm assuming that that's what you mean when you say that the speaking part was easier than the writing part.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of sentence construction, though, so let's take ourselves out of just spontaneous speech, right? And let's take ourselves out of needing to spell everything correctly. Sentence construction, in other words, word after word, building a sentence, building a phrase. Would you say that was easier speaking or writing?
it was probably easier writing because I could pause and think about the grammar and things, but speaking was funner. I don't know.
Okay, so not as fun to write.
Yeah.
But did you feel more confident that you had produced a good sentence with spontaneous speech or with writing?
With writing,
Mm-hmm.
but getting it right wasn't as important when I was just having a conversation.
Okay, so you had two things at play then. You had, one was accuracy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And you felt that you could be more accurate when writing. Is that right? The second issue when you were speaking is that the need to have accuracy was decreased, right? Because you were just speaking off the cuff. So you didn't really have the drive to be as precise with your syntax in that case. Okay, so that's good because that's a sort of typical language learning situation, right? So when you're in a language learning classroom, especially a foreign language learning classroom, by the way, let me mention the difference between foreign language learning and second language learning. Foreign language learning is, for example, learning French in the United States, where there's not necessarily a large French population that you're going to be speaking with. If you were to move to France as an American and learn French there, that would be second language learning. So that is learning a language that is not foreign in the area that you're living. So you have a lot of opportunities outside of the classroom to then use what you're learning in the classroom, right? So you get sort of this sort of extra practice, if you will. Now, you say that if you were speaking, it was okay because there was less emphasis on being as accurate as you probably should be in terms of a native speaker or at least a fluent speaker, right?
Right.
Now, this is interesting because the reason that it takes you longer to produce a good sentence than, say, a native speaker is all about routinization, right? So it's all because your brain is not used to bringing these things up, all these rules and these associations between sound and meaning quickly enough, right? So the question is, are there things that were quicker than others in terms of recall? So if you had to say a sentence, if you had to ask, for example, where the bathroom was, could you do it as quickly as talking about the economy?
I would be able to ask where the bathroom is much quicker than talking about the economy.
Much quicker. And why do you think that would be? Or do you not know?
No, I don't know. Tell us. Chris.
So we would expect that you'd be able to ask where the bathroom is quicker than talking about the economy for a couple of reasons. One, the vocabulary that you learn typically in a foreign language class is going to be much more basic. So talking about something like the economy, more academic type speech or writing, is going to be much more difficult, right? Because you're simply not going to have the lexicon to make that work. But in terms of sentence structure, they shouldn't be all that different, right? So asking where the bathroom is syntactically versus, making a statement about the economy, especially because in French, when you have a question, you typically don't use the sort of verb inversion possibility that is there. You typically will just have a declarative in either case, and you'll know that something is a question by intonation, right? So in that case, they shouldn't really be all that different. Okay, so, but this is sort of non-intuitive, right? Because the point is that if you learned the vocabulary for the economy, you'd probably still be quicker at asking where the bathroom was. Right? Does that sound like a reasonable assumption? And the reason being that you will have probably had more practice asking where the bathroom was than talking about the economy.
Yes.
Okay, so for this, I'm actually going to ask you to leave your French for a second.
Okay.
We took a trip to Europe, 2 years ago now, almost a year and a half ago, and I taught you how to ask for a coffee in German. Now, this is important here. This is going to make a good point to what the point that I'm trying to drive home here. You don't speak German at all.
No.
You have you have no idea, besides ja and nein, you have no idea what any German words are, essentially, right? You can't build a sentence in German.
No.
You don't know what the sentence structure rules are. You don't know about German syntax. You don't know what the word order is, the constituent order, and so on and so forth, right? How do you ask for coffee in German?
Ich werde bitte einen Kaffee haben.
Ich werde bitte einen Kaffee haben. Or ich würde bitte einen Kaffee haben.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Something like that, right?
Excuse me.
Now, the reason you know that is because I taught you how to order coffee
Yes.
in German, right? Now, without any other German knowledge, what you did is you memorized that whole construction just by sound. Now, in your mind, you can't break that construction down, right? You don't know what the different words are, except for maybe cafe, right?
Yeah.
Because cafe and coffee are so close, you think, well, that's the cafe part. You might know the ich, right?
Yeah.
The pronoun I.
From JFK.
Right. But the point is, if I had asked you to come up with how to order a coffee in German, you wouldn't have been able to come up with it on your own.
Right.
Right. So the question is, how do you remember that so easily?
Because I memorized it.
You memorized it. You practiced it as a unit.
Yes.
Okay, now this is where I want to remind you all of the last episode on routinization, where we mentioned construction grammar. And construction grammar is one theory which allows you to describe routinization in terms of constructions that are either atomic or schematic. So this would be a fully atomic construction. In other words, she can't break it down into its parts. You don't know where the verb is, for example. What's the verb in Ich werde bitte einen Kaffee haben?
Werde?
Werden would be the auxiliary verb. The actual verb is pretty much haben at the end, right?
Oh, okay.
But the point is you don't know that, right?
Nope.
So the point is you know it as just a single unit of sound. Okay.
Yes.
That seems to stick pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now, let me ask you this. With small compounds in French, things like how to say hello. How do you say hello in French?
Bonjour.
Bonjour. You remember that very, very quickly.
Yeah.
Even though bonjour technically is a compound, it's used pretty much as a single unit. Okay. Now, in terms of sentence building, would you say it's quicker to just recall something like bonjour or to build a sentence?
Bonjour.
Bonjour, right? Of course. Because you've practiced bonjour, you've said it so many times. You know exactly how it's supposed to sound. You don't need to break it down into parts. You don't need to build it up from parts. Right? It's just one single unit. The point is that, in theory, that kind of thing should stick more than the building blocks. Okay, so if you remember back, construction grammar is sort of the opposite of the Chomskyan theory, which says that you have to build everything from parts, and you learn the parts. Now, in your French class, did you ever learn individual pieces?
Yes.
Yes, what kind of things?
Verbs, vocab.
Right, so you'd learn verbs in isolation.
Yeah.
You'd learn probably pronouns.
Conjugation.
You'd learn conjugation rules for different classes of verbs and so on and so forth. Now, this is the ultimate question. This is the apex of our interview here. In your opinion, was it easier to learn things like that? In other words, you get a table of conjugations and a list of verbs, and you're asked to make a sentence. Or is it easier to be given a sentence, memorize it, and break it down later? Just your opinion.
Well, I guess it'd be easier to break it down later.
Why?
Well, because I'd have to think about it. I'd have to remember the conjugation, any of the grammar. in order to put it all together.
So in other words, it'd be quicker to just memorize it all together and be able to repeat it
Yeah.
as a phrase than to have to build it up from parts and have to go through all the sort of math, if you will,
Right.
of building up the sentence that way.
Right.
Right.
But if you gave me a sentence, then later I could
You can break it down.
put them in their little
Right.
neat places. And
Now I'm going to get really philosophical on you. Okay.
okay.
When you're thinking about a certain word in French, so you're trying to remember a word. So let's say that you are trying to remember a certain verb, doesn't matter what verb, and it's right on the tip of your tongue, but you can't remember it. What strategies might you try and employ to remember that verb?
I would start with pronouns
Why?
because that's how I would use the verb.
So you would try and remember it as it sounds after a pronoun.
Yeah.
In other words, in its conjugated form.
Yeah.
So essentially what you would be doing is trying to jog your memory by starting it with a pronoun because you know in your head, and we're going to get theoretical again, that your brain knows some construction that contains that verb. Okay?
Right.
So let's say, oh, my French is horrible. Dormir is to sleep, right? So
Yeah.
je dors, is that right? If that's not right, I apologize in advance. But let's say it's je dors. Let's say you're trying to remember dormir, right? Now you wouldn't, if you couldn't remember it, you probably aren't going to say, oh, it's dormir right off the bat, right?
No.
But if you started saying je dorme, then you might jog your memory for dormir. In other words, the first thing that would come to your mind is that verb in context. In other words, in a sentence, in a construction. That's the second thing you guys should remember for when we go over exemplar theory. I believe I mentioned something in the last episode that you should also remember for when we go over exemplar theory. The point is that you're searching for an exemplar in your mind. You're searching for some example of that verb in context that you've already used or already heard or something like that. Okay, so what's the takeaway message from this interview here? Would you agree that in general, you remember more things that were taught as, say, whole units than the sort of nitty-gritty verb conjugation type stuff?
Yeah, and actually, the more advanced stuff I think was more about conjugation, like learning conditional and tenses and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the beginning it was more like you were getting the parts and sticking them together, like the avoir expressions, where
Right.
you have I have, which is j'ai,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Right. And that's another
And
interesting
then
point,
you
right?
tack
Because
on whatever you put after that.
right, and that's another interesting point, right? Because how do you produce j'ai out of avoir?
Exactly.
It's irregular, right? So
Yeah.
you don't have a method other than just a completely arbitrary association. You don't have a method for building j'ai out of avoir. You do have a method for remembering j'ai as I have, and then just remembering avoir as to have.
Right.
Right, so you have a method for remembering these things separately, and then on top of that, making the arbitrary association. Oh, it's the same verb. Right. So the question is, how does your mind actually split these things up? And I think that if we think about what you remember better after 2 years of language attrition, it seems to be that your mind will likely remember these things that are more atomic in terms of construction grammar terminology. So things that are not building blocks.
Right.
Things that are entire structures, right? That explains why you still remember how to order coffee in German, even though you don't speak German, right? Because your brain isn't worried about building it up. It can't be. You don't speak German. But it does know what the sounds are and what the sequence is and what the overall association with that construction is, right? So in terms of attrition, then these things seem to stick longer, and therefore we would make the claim that they are more entrenched and or more routinized, or whatever term you want to use. Right? So that's the general idea.
Right.
Now, ASL. Let's talk about ASL a little bit. You're still currently learning ASL. You can't sign over the microphone. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
You're still currently learning ASL, so we can't really talk about language attrition. But we might be able to sort of think about this in the same kinds of terms. So in ASL, do you ever have situations where you're presented whole sort of strings of things together as a unit?
Yes.
And would you say that those are easier to recall or harder to recall than building blocks in sequence?
Like individual signs?
Yeah, let me rephrase the question. Because an individual sign should be just as easy to recall as a sequence of signs is the idea. However, if you are required to come up with a sequence of signs, is it easier to recall one that you've already used in the past or that's brand new, that you're building out of blocks that you've learned?
What I've learned in the past.
What you've learned in the past. So one that you've used before. So in other words, you sort of think back to when you last used it, and that makes it quicker, right?
Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're able to kind of think about how you did it last time, a sort of quote-unquote muscle memory, right? So you've already produced this utterance, if you will, this sequence of signs. Therefore, you can reproduce it much easier than coming up with a brand new sequence, even if you know the building blocks. Right. So all that suggests is that if you have the building blocks, it takes more time to come up with something on the fly than it does to simply reproduce something that's already been built.
Right.
Okay.
Right. That's why, how are you? How old are you? What's your name? All that stuff is phrases that you learn in the beginning. And
right. So if you had a phrase book, for example, those type of things would be in there.
Yeah. And those are the ones that
then they come really quick.
Think of quickest.
Right. So the argument here would be that you think of them quickest because they're presented to you as entire units. And if you had to break those things down, you could do that, right? So if you were asked, what's the sign for, how, you could pull it from how are you, right?
Yes.
That's the idea. Whereas
there are two different ways of doing how.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know that, but but you get the general idea, right?
Yeah.
So.
I would know which one to use based on the fact that I know that how are you is a phrase that means, one way of saying how, and then the other how that I'm just learning now is completely different.
Right.
So.
Right. So this is very interesting. So if we just think about everything we've been talking about so far, your experience in language classes has been fairly typical of modern language classes, right? This is how they teach languages. What they'll do is they'll start out at the beginning with more atomic constructions. In other words, the sort of phrasey type stuff. How are you? Hello. All these kind of things that you just learn at the beginning because it's quick to teach it to you that way, right? You learn, and you can get a lot out of it. So you sort of memorize these long strings, and, you come back from your first week of French, and you can say, how are you? And you can say, I am fine, and all these sort of basic phrases, right? And then they move on and they start teaching you building blocks. And from then on, you have to produce your own utterances, right? The question is, what would happen if they simply kept teaching you phrases?
I would eventually try to, say something new that I haven't said before and probably botch it because I wouldn't have the grammar right. Mm-hmm.
So, and this is, I should mention, this is an open question. I'm just sort of hypothesizing here.
Oh.
I don't know what would happen if you just tried to learn phrases. I'm sure there are language learning methods that do that try and just give you phrase after phrase after phrase. Because after all, when a child learns language, that's all they have for input, right? So they take phrase after phrase after phrase, and they eventually, their brains somehow learn all these rules. The sort of thinking with adults is that adults need to have building blocks in order to build stuff up. And so that's why modern language classes are made the way that they are. the question is, why is there still that concession at the beginning for teaching these phrases when clearly they do work well, right? So you can teach these whole phrases and they do get memorized well and they do get entrenched, and in terms of attrition they seem to last longer and so on and so forth. The question is then, what is the motivation for going back completely and simply sticking with building blocks? Right, so why not do a mix of the two, for example? I don't know if there's a good answer to that question. There might be.
Well, we still learn some phrases and things.
Mm-hmm.
Even in ASL, the third semester that I'm in.
Right.
Just learned a couple last night.
Well, that's good. So, a mix of the two seemed like it should be the best sort of method for adults, right? Because the whole point is, routinization at its core is just a practice makes perfect idea, right? It's just, it's not really more complex than that. So the question is, why so much emphasis, and not necessarily in your language course, but I know in a lot of language courses there is a great amount of emphasis put on just teaching building blocks and sort of forcing the student to make sentences out of these blocks with the belief that that will make them better at making sentences. But unless you put a lot of time into that, it seems to me that it's less effective than teaching phrases and then on top of that teaching how to break them down after the fact. It's just food for thought. It's nothing official here or anything. So anyway, the reason that I've had you here today is just to talk about typical language learning situations, to ask you about what kind of things stuck more in your mind. Certainly it seems to be the case that after a lot of attrition you do remember these more atomic things better than more schematic things. So in other words, you probably couldn't reproduce a full verb conjugation chart from memory.
No, unless it was like the very basic ER verbs.
Right, so you might
regular and
right, so you might get one verb chart, but certainly not all the different verb forms. Whereas if you had a phrase memorized that happened to have an IR verb in it, you'd probably still have the phrase memorized.
Right.
That's the point. So that's pretty much all I wanted to talk to you about today. I just kind of wanted to throw some food for thought out there before I go into child language learning, because adult language learning is really, like I said, it's quite a different beast, and it's still not really clear how adults learn language. They certainly don't learn it as well as children, and they certainly don't use the same methods to learn it. So it's like like I said, it's just food for thought, just something to think about, and hopefully you found it interesting. So I want to thank Katie for being on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
No problem, and I will. And thank you all out there for listening. I know it's been a big delay between podcasts, but hopefully not too long. And I'll have that child language learning one, or child language acquisition. Really, we use the term acquisition because children are so good at it, they just acquire it. They don't have to learn it. I'll have that next podcast out to you as soon as I can. Thanks again.